Ladies and gentlemen, the most anticipated matchup in the world of chess happened earlier today. And that matchup is Magnus Carlsen versus Hans Niemann. Anytime these two go to battle, it's going to be interesting, and I will be breaking it down for all of you. Now, if you happen to somehow watch this video and you don't know what happened between Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann, put one of those words into Google and have at it. But most of you are well acquainted, and if you're not, there's plenty of catching up to do. Now, they have not played a classical game of chess, slow chess, since September 4th, 2022. The day that set off one of the craziest stories, frankly, in all of media, but let's just say in the world of chess. But they have played online. And today they played again. And oh my goodness, it was a dazzling display from the former world champion of chess. Now, since all of this happened, they've played a couple of games on chess.com. Here's one of the games that they played. This game happened quite recently. And in this game, Magnus had the white pieces. They went for a Berlin, not Sicilian, a king's pawn game. And by the middle of the game, all of the pieces had been traded. So clearly, Magnus and Hans were not particularly interested in playing a full game. Then they played another game, which was a very complicated game. This time, Hans went for the Sicilian defense, and you will notice that he had the black pieces. Again, it was super complicated, but it took some 80 moves and a mouse slip for Magnus to defeat Hans. Hans meant to play king here, defending his pawn, and on the 92nd move of that game, he ended up losing. Well, today, Hans had white. So let's see what happens. We have e4. Now, again, Magnus has had white 2 times on chess.com. Hans, this is his first game with the white pieces in a meaningful period of time, I should say, against Magnus. That game, September 4th, 2022, Hans had the black pieces. So Magnus plays king's pawn, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to c4. Hans employing the trusty Italian game. Black has here bishop c5 and knight to f6. Magnus does in fact play knight f6. Now Hans here can enter very forcing lines with knight to g5, leading to things that resemble the fried liver. Some of you may know this very famous trap knight takes f7. If you don't know this very famous trap knight takes f7, you should watch my video on how to play the fried liver. But instead of that, we have d3. d3 is a very solid move, and now generally play goes with bishop c5, at least at the highest level, classical chess. Most people develop the bishop here, white then plays c3, and there are many, 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 many lines. Now, what Magnus plays here is this move h6. This is a very flexible move with a very deliberate intention. Number one, you are trying to prevent anything from going to g5. Number two, you in many lines yourself want to play g5. So you actually want to start a same-side attack against your opponent. It's a very provocative system that leads to some very interesting chess. On the other hand, you also may want to play just g6. And then a position where the bishop goes to g7 is just a very unique kind of Italian, all right? c3, d6, and now Hans plays something I've never seen before. He plays this move a4. Now, I've seen a4. The point of a4 is very simple. You just want to take some space on the queen side. You also want to get the bishop away. You basically want to play like a4, b4, sometimes a5. Now, Magnus just develops his bishop. He's just trying to castle. Now, here is where Hans plays something I've never seen before. Normally, here people are castling, etc. Hans plays a5. Now, that move in and of itself is not anything particularly special, but generally here, black will play the move a6. Because you prevent white from expanding completely, you take away b5, and this pawn now stays there. Now, Magnus castles. And Hans plays a6. a4, a5, a6 is very Alpha Zero-esque. Some of you might have seen my video, Alpha Zero versus Stockfish. Alpha Zero was the earliest form of like a neural network type of engine. And what it loves to do is it loves to push its flank pawns. It loves to kind of create complications for the opponent by utilizing flank pawns. Now, if black were to take, black would have doubled isolated A pawns. White is actually not even in a rush to take here. White could just sort of leave those pawns there. Magnus plays b6 and basically says, look, Hans, this pawn is more of an asset for me than a liability, right? He's basically saying black is going to target that pawn forever. However, Hans's play has made Magnus's position have a lot of pawns on dark squares, which means his dark squares are good. Light squares are a little bit weak. So we have castles. Magnus plays bishop e6. The reason he is playing bishop to e6, by the way, may surprise you, because normally you have all these pawns on the dark squares and you're like, well, why would I trade my light squared bishop? So the piece that can move in between all the things now gets traded. Well, the thing is, when you do this, white now no longer has any light squared players, right? I mean, these pieces aren't going to play on the light square diagonals. You could play a move like queen b3, black will play queen d7, or even more actively with d5. So that's why bishop to e6. Now, there is a case to be made that Hans should play bishop to b5. But okay, we have takes, takes. The engine likes this. Knight bd2, queen d7. And Magnus is just kind of moving his pieces forward. At some point, he will probably play d5. Another benefit of making this exchange by black is that even though this is a potential weakness that can be exploited by the white pieces, you now have the f file. So you will play rook f7, rook f8, and potentially create a kingside attack. Now, here, white needs to play energetically. I'm talking moves like b4. And the point is that if, you prepare all of this, I don't have to rush with b5 because there's knight a5. But even if I do, this would be a win for white because this rook now doesn't have any easy access. Hans plays rook e1, which, he played it very fast. It's a pretty solid move. It defends the center. It frees up knight to f1. It has a lot of ideas. Magnus plays rook d8, clearly showing he has an interest in playing the move pawn to d5. Hans plays knight f1. And from the opening, it's actually Magnus down 36 seconds on the clock in a blitz game. So Hans has played every move relatively quickly, but it's still a very close position. The only thing that's been traded is those pair of bishops. So both guys are still looking for a way to break through. Hans plays h3. h3 is almost always a useful move. In fact, the way Hans has played this, every single move that he has made is relatively straightforward and is seen in typical Italian games. Now we have rook f8. So Magnus decides, all right, it's time to go down the f-file. Again, black is sort of sitting around waiting, and in many ways, this advance by Hans was very clever. Very, very smart, putting the pawn on a6. In fact, it's so clever, it's actually almost a shock he used this kind of concept in a Title Tuesday game. Like, a4, a5, a6 is a deep idea that you generally might see in a classical game. So, yeah, from the opening, it's Hans who enjoys a very nice position. Now, ironically, here, this knight should go to h2. Because actually, believe it or not, like let's say black just plays a regular move. In many positions, I'm not saying even right now, but in many positions, this trade is kind of nice for white. Now, right now, black would play d5. But this reinforces this, whereas this move, as natural as it is, believe it or not, is incorrect because the knight doesn't quite have a future. You put the knight on g3 because it likes to go to f5, but you put the knight on h2 to support this if it's not possible. Now here, black already, the engine is finding all these different sacrificial ideas. Magnus plays queen c8, just, passing the move back to white. Bishop to e3, knight gets out of the way to d7. Obviously, that's the idea. Maybe, by the way, knight b8, knight a6. Never say never. And now the move b4 would grant Hans a +1 advantage, according to the engine. So the opening and now the kind of middle game maneuvering phase has gone to Hans. Just like in that Sicilian game that I showed. He is a fighter. He really is. He plays d4, which is kind of a similar concept to b4, just trying to go in here, take. And he's got Magnus on the back foot, who plays knight to b8. This is a fascinating position. Because the point is, Magnus has been totally pushed back. b8, queen there, the doubled rook's fine. Here the move d5, straight down the middle, would have made a lot of problems for black. After pawn takes, you could play knight to b4, the pawn's gonna fall, but while the pawn is falling, white can enjoy other various advantages. For example, white can create a threat on the knight and then go over here, and suddenly, this is real bad. And it's not even a matter of queen h6, it's a matter of this rook, and suddenly the whole center is open. And because these knights got pushed all the way to the side, the attack is now suddenly possible. Now that's kind of difficult to find in blitz. So Hans just defends the pawn with his queen. Can you really blame him? But this one moment of hesitation. Again, it's a blitz game against Magnus. You don't know where he is. He might be playing on the phone. He might be, I don't know. But the point being, you're not going to get a lot of chances. The second you go here and you respect this, and by the way, look at Hans. He spent 27 seconds That's the longest that he had spent on a move thus far. Now here comes knight b4, and the problem is, not only do you lose the pawn in the long run, the bigger problem is counterplay. Now white has something to deal with, and the game is very quickly back in the balance. And it's very important as a chess player. By the way, this is very much a do as I say, not as I do thing. I'm going to tell you, once you start losing control of a game, it is very difficult to get that control back. Same with any sporting event, right? So the best move here, according to the computer, is to play king h1. Nobody is playing king h1 here. I don't care. It's not possible. Now, a much more human move is maybe to take. Hans decides, all right, here we go. He says there is no way Magnus can be playing with a c-pawn considering there's a queen on the other side of the board. Let's go e5. So if takes, I'm going to get my knight there. And Magnus plays d5. So white's pawns are suddenly in the way of his own pieces. So Hans advances, but now his pawns are frozen. Keep in mind, the move that he was supposed to do is d5, guaranteeing that the position were to open up. Now after d5, Hans takes, we have bc, and suddenly it's like, where does white move any of his pieces? Right? Where does he go? He has no forward movement. Knight h5 is fine, but there's no threat. Black, in the meantime, will go here, pressure this, pressure the pawn on e5, maybe take the pawn on a6, a lot of different moves. But these pieces suddenly have no forward momentum. And Magnus starts reversing things. Knight d4. Hans still goes for something concrete, right? But what's the idea? I mean, you're not even threatening the pawn, right? And okay, can't take. So Magnus gets out of the pin. Now the knight's hanging. Now the knight's got to move. So Hans goes here. Now, still to his credit, he's up on the clock. Like, he's still putting very meaningful clock pressure on Magnus. Magnus can take on c2. He plays d4, though. So the bishop is hanging. Pawn goes to d3. And this is where things can totally spin out of control. Rook to d1. Now the knight jumps back to block. By the way, that move was played 30 seconds later. He spent 30 seconds on that move. He was probably calculating d3, knight b4, de2, rook d7, knight d7, knight c6. And he probably didn't like that this pawn was falling in those lines. So he shields his position and basically says, I'm not going to get into a tactical fight with you where I might blunder something in my low time. I'm going to control the game. And the other problem is the bishop is now hanging. When the bishop leaves, you know what else falls? Your king. A long, long time ago, Magnus offered a trade of bishops. And he had a feeling that this would open up in the future. Which is what happened. Bishop d2, rook takes f2. Now, under normal circumstances, you take. White got 2 rooks, black has a queen and a pawn. Except this is a dagger. You cannot get out of this. Queen f7 is fatal, so you lose everything. If you try to make a run for it, queen f7, king g4, you probably get mated. I don't exactly know where it is. You don't want to lose the bishop, and even this might be winning because at least I get the knight back, but there is a mate there. So we have queen g4. Hans says, I'm not giving up my queen. I'm only a pawn down. I'm threatening bishop h6, potentially, to get a mate. Threatening knight h5, potentially. The king goes to h8. Magnus down below 20 seconds. Hans threatens checkmate. In a miraculous turn of events, the best player of all time, arguably, does not blunder it. Plays bishop here. Queen is protecting mate. Bishop is potentially rerouting, and the queen is potentially coming to the f-file. Now Hans goes for complications. Both guys are around 20 seconds on the clock, so Hans plays b4. The idea of b4 is to loosen the grip on the center. If you ever take that pawn, I'm taking on d4, not taking on b4. That pawn is there to fall. So instead of that, we have knight c6. Magnus 16 seconds, Hans 21. We have bc5. The pawn has been given away, but the center pawn has fallen as well. Here, Hans actually has to give up a piece. Queen g7, king g7, and at the end of the sequence, you have knight takes d4, but nobody's ever going to play that. Instead, we have this. Now, if we just pause here, if we remove this, 19 versus 13 seconds, equal material. I understand the engine is sitting over there going, it's not that easy. It's not that easy. The top winning move here for black is rook g2 check. What? Point being, then you go queen c6 and you set up an unstoppable discovered attack. I mean, nobody's finding that. Queen e4 doesn't even do anything because you still go here. You can't take, and you lose the queen. I mean, you can take and you lose the queen. You can't take with the queen because you're pinned. So he doesn't see that. Bishop c7. Magnus has 9 seconds remaining. But every time he makes a move, he gains some bonus time. Hans goes queen e4. Now we have queen f7. We see both plans implemented. Queen goes to the f-file. We call this the triple stack. 19 points of material barreling down the file. Knight is hanging on h5. Hans plays knight back to g3. Now, Magnus has a feeling. He's got a lot of pieces. There's a very famous clip on YouTube of Kasparov's calculations, and then I made a clip called Kasparov's Calculations Explained. And in that clip, Garry Kasparov says, I looked at my opponent's king, I looked at all of the pieces pointing at my opponent's king, and I knew I was winning. This is no different. You've got all 6 pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You need to smell the blood in the water. Knight f3 check! The queen and the rook are disconnected from the defense of this one, but if you take, knight takes bishop, discovered attack on the queen. So that doesn't work. Now, what's the alternative? You have to take the knight, because if you don't, knight takes d2. So he takes the knight. Magnus backs up. So for a moment, Hans Niemann is up a knight, but it's hanging. Can't defend it. He's got to move it. So he moves it. Here comes Magnus's queen. h3 is falling. It's actually probably going to fall to the rook, but it can fall to the queen as well. And all of these pieces are standing around really nicely. But every single important square in the position is occupied by Magnus. Magnus does not play games like this normally. I'm not saying he doesn't play brilliant games. He's not a sacrificial guy launching devastating kingside attacks. But it's almost as if the chip on the shoulder versus Hans brings this out of him, which I love. So we have queen g4, the queen re-centralizes, the knight is hanging, queen h2 is straight up checkmate. So when the knight goes to block, the knight captures on f4, and that hangs the rook one more time, but then knight e2 would still be fatal. So knight e2 check, king g2, and now rather than taking his queen, Magnus uncorks, queen h2 check, king to f1, rook takes f3, and the king returns to his home square and gets mated in the center of the board. I'm telling you, we don't usually get games like this from Mr. Magnus Carlsen. Generally, when he plays e4, e5 games, he strangles the opponent. He sucks the life out of the position. They blunder a pawn somewhere. In this game, he played KG chess. He played along the 8th rank. He was baiting his opponent in. Hans had a great position. b4 was a nice idea. He went d4, and right here, he needed to not respect the play on the queen's head. He had to go straight down the middle with d5, and he was up a minute on the clock. I mean, I gotta tell you, he did put a lot of pressure on Magnus, but ultimately he played defensively, and immediately came the counterplay. Immediately the center was locked. Immediately White's pieces had no future. And then Magnus didn't hesitate. Sealed off the d-file. Rook f2, every piece participated. I mean, you talk about an effort where every single piece Magnus has is participating, whereas these pieces kind of didn't. And Hans's rook on a1 stayed a bit in the corner. When it was time to devastate, he did. Knight f4, beautiful coordination. And this time, the previous game was shaky. The previous game, it took Magnus like 90 moves to break through, and it was a scramble. And this one, Magnus said, nope. Y'all must have forgot, I'm still the man. So Magnus victorious over Hans in the title Tuesday of July 9th, 2024. Still waiting for the first big win of Hans over Magnus in the title Tuesday. It's going to make news. But, you know, Hans has now been defeated by 2 top 3 most popular chess players on the planet. Me and Magnus. And sometimes Hikaru too. So. But that's, you know, I'm just saying I got to insert myself into the conversation. I'm pretty happy. No, all jokes aside, Hans is top 5 on chess.com and Blitz on any given day, and I am very happy with my win, but this was a very impressive win by Magnus, and he went on to win Title Tuesday with 10 out of 11. Hans got 3rd. It was his only loss. So, like, these guys are killers. They're really, really good, and it's always exciting when they play, and I have a feeling Hans will probably watch this video on stream and say some not nice things about me, but hey, the second that Hans beats Magnus, I'm making a video about it too. I'm just saying. So that's all I have for you today. Very fun, very exciting game between 2 of the most popular chess players on the planet. If you're watching this on July 9th, 2024, I have a chess tournament coming up. I'll be playing 2 chess tournaments in July. go to the Road to GM playlist here on the GothamChess YouTube channel. And if you have any of my courses, listen, it's not a pitch. I'm not telling you to buy anything. If you have any of my courses or you want to try them for free, no cost to you, free. Chessly, on Chessly, I should say, we are doing a leaderboard challenge. So we have a huge scoreboard. We turned it into a little bit of an arcade. And if you want to submit your game for Guess the ELO future episodes, go to Chessly and you'll see what you got to do. You got to do some exercises. You got to get your points up, and then you can submit a game for Guess the ELO. So that's all I have for you today. Get out of here.